Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today joined by a very special guest, Lloyd George. Alice, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Erik. I'm excited to chat.
So Alice, you recently announced Rogue. Why don't you describe what Rogue is and what is the thesis behind it?
For sure, yeah. So a lot of people like to know where the origins of the name Rogue come from. You know, going rogue, doing your own thing. I spent 5 years at RRE Ventures in New York City and then decided to build my own shop. It was a long time in the making and kind of a culmination of a lot of things I'm excited about and focusing in on those things. You know, it's also a nod to the superheroes, both on the Star Wars side and on the X-Men side, to any nerds listening. The focus of the fund is seed stage and frontier tech and culture. So I think a lot of folks are probably familiar with frontier or deep tech as a concept. You know, Lux Capital's been doing purely that for 20 years. They've helped establish those categories. For me, the areas there have been everything from robotics, including machine learning, computer vision, and applied verticals, space tech, spatial computing. And then on the frontier culture side, not such a defined bucket, but broadly, I've spent time across sort of gaming, the metaverse, a very new emerging category, and some crypto. But broadly, I have a thesis there around creativity meets tech, which I'd love to get into. It's evolving very fast, I should add.
Let's get into it right now. Why don't you unpack that, the creativity meets tech, and talk about how it's evolving?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the way that I think about it is I love reading about Silicon Valley history and all kind of the legendary figures and stories. And I kind of think about the layers that have built up over time, you know, almost like geology and kind of the seismic shifts within those. But in my mind, you've got the kind of like 70s, 80s, 90s of core tech infrastructure and, you know, all the semiconductor companies, the Intels, and then the accessibility layers of the internet on top, like, right, the Netscapes and the Googles. And then we've had this layer of probably companies that our generation are more familiar with and huge value creation in marketplaces and utility, things like Airbnb and Uber, which, you know, were enabled by the real-time app economy. And for me, what I'm really excited about now is this new layer that I think of as sort of creators who are able to, you know, generate real value and capture it. In my mind, these definitely look a little different than the founders we've seen in the past. They're not necessarily, although they could be coming from, you know, the Stripes and the Salesforces and those types of companies in the Valley, and they're not necessarily going to be funded by the old Valley firms. I think it's a new generation of founders who are really on the pulse of culture and tapped into community. People like yourself who are, you know, really able to build community. That's a very powerful thing, I think. And I think part of it is driven by the costs of tech coming down, right? And all the tools being accessible. That stuff is almost commoditized and ideas are distributed everywhere. You know, people have good ideas across the country. I'd say before the pandemic, I was generally looking in places like New York or LA or Austin for some of these folks that were more on the culture pulse. Now I think they're really going to be anywhere, and it's more about being in the networks with them. And crypto has really highlighted this the last few months.
Yeah, totally. And how do you make sense of what's happened the past few months? I know you've been thinking about NFTs for quite some time now. How do you sort of make sense of everything that's happening, and what does it mean in terms of what to expect going forward?
You know, I'm still like, I think I still feel almost some whiplash by how fast things seem to be going, in the sense that I feel I've been excited and impatient for these categories for many years. I got my start in venture in 2013 when I was interning for a guy named Rick Thompson on Sand Hill Road, and was very lucky to sort of have that chance to get exposure to the Valley at Signia Ventures. And, at that time, I personally was going to a lot of Bitcoin meetups. And most people that I talked to about, Bitcoin kind of said, you're crazy. And then I met Jim Robinson from RRE, Jim 4, who is a very intellectually curious guy and a tinkerer. And he really was doing a deep dive into this and testing out all sorts of multi-sig wallets. And at that time, the stuff that got me excited, and I ultimately ended up joining RRE and helped Jim and worked with him really closely on the crypto portfolio. But what got me excited was the sort of 2.0 promise, which was, I guess back then it was master coin, counterparty, colored coins, coins that could be imbued with different colors that would have different properties. So that was pretty early. It was before Ethereum. I went up with Adam Ludwin and Jim to the Ethereum conference in Toronto in early 2014 before the pre-sale, and we were so excited for that. 2017 was the mad ICO craze, and then CryptoKitties, we invested in Dapper Labs through DCG, was probably one of the first real moments for NFTs, along with CryptoPunk. So it feels like a really long journey, but then also really sudden, and because there's been so many waves, for me, I've sort of was very involved 2014, 15, 16. We did probably 13 investments at RRE, mostly small investments. And then kind of I stepped back and I've been watching these waves. So long story short, it's hard to know with each wave what's real, what's not. And I think there's always some froth, new people come in, and then important work continues to happen in between, right? When people build. But this time I'm really excited because it's touching people in my life who are outside of crypto and outside of finance. So that to me is part of the reason I got involved originally. It's not the self-referential stuff. I think DeFi is really exciting and will change a lot in finance. But the thing with NFTs that's changing and having ripple effects through media is really exciting because, artists that I've supported and worked with and known for years in the digital art world are doing really well and able to monetize work that was previously, not valued by the market and treated as a hobby. So, people think it's a bubble and sometimes the numbers are frothy, but I think the innovations underlying it can be real.
And so where are you looking to invest?
That's a good question. I have an investment through Rogue in one of the NFT platforms, and I'm looking at a few others. I think I'm very excited by what companies are doing, including Zora Foundation, OpenSea. The last few months, the sales on those platforms, and they have slightly different models, have all grown tremendously. Super Rare has been an early kind of presence in the space, and I think helped pioneer two-ish years ago the whole category. But everything is evolving very quickly, right? They're adding features day by day. The models of the different platforms are also shifting, right? So it's become more of a kind of, I wouldn't say a consensus thing, but maybe a consensus thing to allocate 10% of secondary sales to go back to the creator. I think we'll start to see a lot of experimentation with that, right? Like Grimes sold an NFT, which I managed to get one of those the other day on Nifty Gateway, and her proceeds, or some of them, are going to a carbon charity, environmental charity. So I'm excited to see things like that start to happen. I think to your question of how to invest, obviously there's the platforms, and then there's the assets, and then there's the tokens of the platforms. So it's still pretty early days, but I'm just excited by the amount of talent, and kind of energy right now. And I think almost sometimes you see those graphics on the internet of like the early browser wars, and you see one browser pulling ahead and another browser pulling ahead. And then you zoom back, and 10 years later, it turns out a completely different player won. Or same thing with the auto industry, where you see those graphics of like Tesla being 0.0001%, and then suddenly it's massive. So I think we are still almost in day one of a lot of this stuff. So too early to tell, as we used to say at my old firm.
Yeah. I want to take some of the spaces that we mentioned earlier in terms of your scope within Frontier and culture and look at them both in terms of how they've evolved over time, because you've been investing for, what seems like almost a decade now. And then also your sort of requests for startups or where you're looking going forward. So maybe we could start with where you're more excited in terms of climate tech or what you're looking for there.
Yeah, a lot of different approaches to carbon. I mean, energy obviously is the holy grail, right? We need to up our placement on the Kardashev scale of energy, right? Which measures how advanced a civilization is. We're still, I think, at like 0.00 something. We haven't even got to 1 yet. 1 is when we're able to harvest, I think, all the sunlight that would hit planet Earth. So we're not nearly there. I think that nuclear is really promising. It still remains really controversial, but there's a bunch of really smart people working on small nuclear. And that's exciting to me because there's really no limits to nuclear. And I think, I used to spend a lot of time in a prior life before tech focusing on distributed generation and microgrids. And I think, seeing sort of like some of the crises in energy the last few months has made it more apparent that our current systems are really fragile. I think there's a lot of talent flowing towards building interesting companies here. And I'd love to see, some marks and bigger exits, which can also draw more talent into the space.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's transition into space tech and spatial computing. Why don't you sort of just give an overview of how the space has evolved since you've been investing in it, and how that's affected what are the types of things you've looked at or looked for?
Yeah, I love space. I've always been a space nerd. So I felt really lucky when I was at RE to work with Will Porteous, who is a phenomenal space investor and great human. And he led our portfolio there. And I worked with him across, I guess, 6 or so investments. So, we were invested in everything from ionic propulsion with Axion to launch systems with spaceflight, which was essentially rideshare to space. And then a bunch of constellations. So I got to know Black Sky pretty well on their board, imaging constellation, and then Spire, led by Peter Platzer, which is basically ADS-B and AIS, which is ship and plane tracking and weather data. Spire now has the 3rd largest constellation, over 100 satellites up, and a really impressive revisit rate. And I think they've disclosed that they're now doing laser to laser communications between the satellites, which is really exciting. So on a really high level, a lot has changed since 2014. The main thing, of course, that everyone has talked about that's really impactful is how much the cost of launch has been brought down. The cost per kilogram to reach LEO, or low Earth orbit, has come down about 90% in the last decade, which is insane. It's just opened up a whole new, economy that wasn't there before. And so I think there's a lot of focus on SpaceX, and they've been a big part of the story. And of course, the comms innovation recently is really exciting that they're, working on. But there's a lot of other entrepreneurs now who have been enabled. And I think it's kind of like the beginning of a new renaissance there. So, I think it's like 100 billion that's gone in the last maybe 16, 17 years into space companies. And there's a lot of new ideas that haven't really been tested before either, which I get excited about. So there's companies doing, manufacturing in microgravity because that's suddenly more feasible than it was before for the right types of materials. So yeah, I haven't backed any space tech company yet from Rogue, but I expect I will, and I'm excited to jump back in and do more.
Let's talk about gaming and the metaverse. These are spaces you've been excited about for a long time. Why don't you talk about how they've evolved?
Yeah, I'm very excited for what's going on in gaming, and I guess within that or adjacent to that, the metaverse. I think that it's both exciting, but you also have to kind of pace yourself with the frustrations of just wanting the stuff to hit faster, and it certainly has accelerated in the last year. With lockdown, gaming's been up 100%, but people forget that a company like Epic's been around for over 25 years and had quite a few different chapters, right? When Tim Sweeney started, it was like he was like a shareware developer. He was making games that he literally sold through the mail or like on bulletin board systems. You know, he was a publisher. Epic was a publisher, I should say. And then kind of they realized that live games were the way to go rather than these big retail releases. And I think that Riot was a major pioneer in that, and also Valve and Steam. And of course, Tencent, they've all pushed this forward. But I guess broadly, you know, where we are is the stuff that gets me excited is where, you know, we're moving away from just pure FPS or first person shooter games to social games. And I think the amount of value that hasn't been tapped into in identity and kind of virtual economies and virtual goods is where I get super excited. So one company that I've, you know, been involved with for a couple of years, it's a good example of the rogue kind of thesis on virtual culture, is Wave. Wave is not a direct investment in gaming. It's sort of adjacent. They basically have pioneered this format of live events or shows and concerts in MMOs. So, you know, they've been doing this since 2016, or I guess I met them in 2016 at GDC, the Game Developers Conference. And initially, Adam and Aaron, the founders, you know, they were using VR, but that was always kind of incidental to the core concept, which is how do we bring people together and take the concepts of like EDM culture, right? Peace, love, understanding, respect, and just that connection, and bring that to a virtual world. And they kind of saw what was going on in Japan with the VTuber explosion, which is essentially people streaming themselves, you know, live as anime and avatar characters, which we have obviously Twitch in the West, but we don't really have people streaming themselves as anime. And they realized you could do this with really lightweight mobile tech and software. And so they adopted that for Wave, and it's worked really well, where in the last year, they've streamed people like John Legend live, and they generated, I think, 500K for charity out of that. They streamed The Weeknd, the singer, into TikTok and had 1.8 billion views of that event, which speaks to how crazy TikTok's reach is. But I think the core insight and what I have always been excited about with Wave is they're not trying to replicate the real world. And I think I felt very early on in lockdown exhausted by the attempts of people to just replicate the real world and stream it. I think we're all tired of kind of Zoom rectangles, and that's a big part of the pandemic fatigue. And what Wave has done is really transport people into surreal, fantastic worlds that offer something completely different, right? And that's what's really special. And I think Epic has been experimenting with this. Roblox has been experimenting with it. And where I think it's successful is when they kind of apply a different lens, because it's very hard to compete with the real world. But if you can suddenly have everyone experience, you know, float and have zero gravity, that's pretty awesome. They did that in the Marshmallow Fortnite concert, which was fun. And then the other thing that's amazing, of course, is that these are mostly, they haven't been ticketed events, but they've generated tens of millions of revenue in very short amount of time, you know, usually under 20 minutes, these concerts. And that's from the sale of virtual goods and assets. So I was in the Marshmallow concert. The skin cost $15 US. You multiply that by 12 million concurrent players. And these are incredible businesses with very low marginal cost to create virtual goods. And so that's an area I'm spending a lot of time in. I think it's been, you know, gaming in general has been overlooked by the Valley. People tend to say gaming's a hits business, but then you look at kind of all this latent passion and demand for virtual goods and services. And I think there's a lot to be built there. If you even look at just Animal Crossing, which I was obsessed with at the beginning of lockdown, I probably spent over 100 hours, you know, playing / researching Animal Crossing. Nintendo is an amazing company when it comes to IP. They released this game at the beginning, or I guess a year ago, the beginning of lockdown, and it did $1 billion in sales in the first month or 4 to 5 weeks. But the social experience was terrible. Firstly, you have to have a Nintendo Switch to play, which, reduces the TAM to people who can afford and access the hardware. And then, even just visiting other people's islands is really difficult and glitchy. And if something happened with the internet, your plane could not make it to their island and you'd have to restart and reboot. And it was a total pain. But a lot of this activity shifted over to Discord and eBay, where people are trading skins and items and recipes. And there's this whole extra layers of, economies across hundreds of servers in Discord, which I think just points to how much people want to build and trade, virtual goods and items and assets. And, the NFT craze right now is just another expression of that. And stepping back to like the 10,000 foot level, I really do think all these things will converge, and it will take time, and the sequencing will be probably surprising, but crypto and gaming and virtual worlds are all coming together, and these internet subcultures are driving a lot of it. And I don't think that Wall Street or Main Street and some parts of Silicon Valley are ready for that, or even appreciate how powerful these forces are. I think the whole Reddit Wall Street bets thing was really, to me, indicative of that people didn't quite understand the communities and the motivations and how powerful those forces are.
And say more about what this could look like, or what types of phenomena, so is GameStop with just this is the wedge into something much more. What could this all look like, or what are you expecting?
That is a good question. I mean, I think that people, haven't quite appreciated how important virtual identity is going to be, and that people want to express themselves in a lot of different ways. That's starting to be unlocked. And we see companies like Brud behind Little Michaela who are experimenting with that. I think we see, a lot of, obviously, crypto wealth is driving kind of exploration of new areas that might not otherwise have been funded. I've seen crypto wealth going into all types of, I guess, nerd places that wouldn't otherwise have been funded by traditional capital. And so I think that brings, to me, it's pretty exciting. It's like 1,000 flowers blooming in innovation right now. And I think that you see that certainly with some of the numbers. I mean, just today, Beeple, who of course has been one of the catalysts of the recent kind of NFT mania, sold an artwork for $60 million US, which makes him one of the top 3 most valuable living artists on the planet. So I think today, what is today, March 11th? I'm not sure. Will just be remembered in the history of kind of, digital goods and creativity. Largely, I think that it's exciting that, this vision of the internet, which it seems like people had a few decades ago, that I think of like as a random walk down sort of an internet with a lot of glitter and a lot of kind of diversity and quirkiness. Maybe we'll have a return to that, which I think we sort of detoured away from that towards these centralized vanilla platforms with high take rates. And now it's going to be a lot more weird and wonderful, which, I welcome. I think a lot of people think of it as dystopian, but I kind of like the diversity of expression. And I think there's going to be so many interesting pockets to explore. And, there was attempts at kind of funding different expressions through like the Patreons or Twitches or Kickstarters, but crypto is really going to accelerate it in a way that wasn't fully possible before. So that's just on the kind of, I don't know, I call it the glitter of the internet almost.
Yeah, let's talk about Roblox. What do you find so interesting about that, or what does that portend to what else should exist? Or
yeah, I mean, I think Roblox, so they direct listed yesterday, so it's super relevant, and this is a company I've been excited about for a long time. And I want to back the next Robloxes and Epics and Discord, so that's what I'm looking for, and Unities, which has also been one of my favorite companies. But Roblox is probably one of these first real marks for the history of the metaverse, right? Which will take a long time, and there's a lot of features and attributes that need to get built out. So it's sort of a huge but little experiment in the metaverse. There's about 36 million people globally that use it every day. So they direct listed yesterday, and the shares, I think, went up to about $70. So about 40 billion valuation, which is pretty impressive since most people don't really know what metaverse is yet. What I think is amazing there, which sort of relates to what I was saying about this kind of serendipity and creativity around the internet that may come back, is that the UGC is so powerful. And you don't, Epic's a really impressive company, but you don't see that same flywheel with Epic that you see with Roblox, where there's actually 18 million UGC games and experiences on Roblox. Although I think about 10 million of them are actually active. But the kind of accessibility of the platform to kids who want to sort of make money or create is amazing. So the top game on Roblox is Adopt Me, which is basically a simulation in which you raise your like virtual pet or child. So, me with my Tamagotchi in the 90s, this is like that version on crack. And about a quarter of Roblox players play Adopt Me. It was started by a kid who was in elementary school who just started coding in their free time. And then one of the interns that worked at Roblox then joined them. And they did about 10 million in sales last year from this game built on top of Roblox. And then if you think about, it's hard to extrapolate what you can say about Gen Z, but I do like to think about Gen Z. And one thing that's interesting about Adopt Me is that people kind of go on dates within Adopt Me. It's a sort of subculture where two people will like raise a virtual pet together or a virtual kid and sort of see if they work well, which I think is really interesting. There's all these sorts of behaviors that are emerging and, I think really interesting. But Roblox is definitely one to watch. Actually, I did a whole analysis of the S1, which with a group of people that was really fun. If you Google the generalist Roblox, you'd probably find it. It's a great little piece we did.
Talk about game engines.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing there is, right now it's a sort of I've been looking to invest in game engines for a while, and definitely open to all sort of pitches and conversations. I was excited to potentially invest in Unity, but it was too late stage for us at my previous firm. But obviously Unity and Unreal are kind of the leaders right now, and they have incredible moats, very different moats, those two, but they're kind of converging in terms of their offerings, right? Where Unreal started on the very high end, and Unity started, I think, more on the low end and has kind of gone up the pole. But I do think that, we're going to start to see more types of innovation. And I've been talking to lots of interesting companies in that bucket. And then the other thing that is probably like this weird dark horse, and it's certainly not on the scale of Unity and Unreal, which now touch on so many different industries, right? Enterprise as well as Hollywood. But the dark horse kind of activity that I find interesting is these, I guess, gaming architecture spaces that are where people are putting their digital assets. So I don't know if you've spent time in crypto voxels or Decentraland or Somnium. They're not great user experiences, but I think the activity there is interesting. And obviously they're quite different models than these very professional game engines. But we bought a bunch of Mana and Decentraland land through DCG back in the day, and it's definitely come a long way. I spoke to someone today who there's like commercial real estate businesses now starting in there almost, where people want to rent land and, rent architects and construction people to build within those spaces, which is pretty amazing. Like it's moving very fast, all of this. The question from our perspective where we say is like, okay, what are the venture investable businesses in these arenas, and how should we think about, what is venture investable? But broadly, I'm just thrilled to see like a lot of these futures that I've believed in for many years, sort of starting to hit when there was definitely a couple of years of I don't know, more tiring years where the work was getting done, but everyone just said, "Oh, you're too early." So you have to be patient.
What did we not discuss that you're also excited about in terms of things you're looking to invest in, or you'd like entrepreneurs to be experimenting in?
Let's see. I mean, I'm really looking for. I know it's sort of cliche, but I am really looking for individuals that can create new spaces, and that's a really hard thing to do. My own podcast, which I hope people go listen to, called Flux, is sort of focused on this, which is, pioneers in different arenas. So why does, one of the guests I had on was Keller Ronaldo from Zipline. Why does he decide to go do something like building fixed wing drone delivery of emergency blood supply in Rwanda versus, build a sales force for X vertical in the Valley, which, these are very different types of companies. And, Peter Thiel talks about the 0 to 1. I think I've always been fascinated by the Elon Musk profiles. And of course, he's had such a crazy year or two now that, his name has even different connotations. But I'm curious about where those founders come from and what motivates them and why they choose to do something entirely new, and the kind of the new futures that are opened up by people like that. I mean, Elon building Tesla and SpaceX has opened up these categories in a way that, wouldn't have been possible without him as an individual. So within the categories I'm interested in, I'm always looking for, the founders who can do that. And it's a very hard thing for all founders, to create something out of nothing, but especially when the industry doesn't even really exist yet. Timing is so hard, and you have to sell your both your investors and your employees and your business partners on your vision. So I really respect those people that can do that. And that's where I'm excited to spend my time. And, I've definitely read a lot of sci-fi and spent my time in a lot of sci-fi. I spend a lot of time in VR. And so I live in these worlds, and it is exciting to see them happen. And it's one thing to have the vision, but it's, entirely different to execute. So it's great to have kind of Elon proving out that these are viable commercial returns so that, he's paved the way for other founders to follow. And I think we see that also just, to bring it back down to earth in the exit markets, right? With these paths to liquidity for frontier companies that didn't really exist before. So SPACs has obviously been a big part of that. I've seen a bunch of my prior portfolios basically get listed through SPACs and get that liquidity in the last few months, which is really exciting, especially in things like space tech or in deeper tech, where I think companies were able to do seed rounds or A rounds, but there was always that kind of crunch in the later stage rounds because the public markets didn't really understand how to value deep tech. But now there's a lot of public appetite, right? And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think it's an exciting time to be building frontier tech and culture.
Cool. Another space you've looked a bit about is in AR VR. Why don't you talk about where you've been excited there?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been a sombering time at the bottom of the hype cycle for VR, AR. But I think, sometimes these things take a bit longer to play out, but I still believe in those futures. On the VR side, people have been building, and I think what we've seen with Oculus's Quest 2 is a TAM expansion that perhaps people weren't really paying attention to. The ease of use of the Quest 2 cannot be underestimated. It is like when I started off in VR, I was building my own computers, and it would take an hour or two to get things set up. On the Vive, I was a big Vive user for a while, and now you can literally put on your headset, and within 2 minutes, you're in an experience. So I think now the challenges are really just around compelling content and, and navigability across different environments, because I think there's still a lot more diversity of experience on Steam, but Oculus is the most seamless experience sort of user experience in terms of the hardware. But I do think, this will converge with some of the other stuff we've talked about. Somnium, the virtual world with sort of crypto-based assets in it, is available in VR, Decentraland as well. So yeah, I think that people forget that, Pokemon Go's numbers continue to crush every quarter that came before. Niantic is an amazing company. They've been acquiring quite a bit of talent, really good talent in things like slam tech is one area where they've done a great job. I participated in one investment called Gowalla from Rogue, which I'm really excited about. Josh Williams is a really beloved founder who previously built a company called Gowalla, in the what used to be social local mobile nexus, and he's bringing it back with Gowalla launching this summer. And I think with all the excitement right now around collectibles, being able to run around the real world and collect things in the real world is something really cool. And it will get people moving again and running around outside. And so I think we're still early in consumer AR outside of Niantic. And I think it's going to be amazing to see a lot more creativity coming.
Totally. And one other space I wanted to cover, because I know you spent some time thinking about it before we end this, is biotech and longevity. Why don't you talk a little bit about how you viewed that?
Yeah, I mean, I personally have been interested in longevity for a while. I think it can be tough from an investment perspective, right? You've got to sort the snake oil from the real stuff. But there are real people who are passionate about this, who spent their careers on it. And one of those people who I've always been excited to back is James Payer, who I actually met at a talk he gave. He was talking about how they discovered rapamycin on Easter Island, and he's spent his career building longevity companies and investing for family offices. And as soon as he told me he was building a company, I said I wanted to be a part of it. So I think Cambrian, his new thing, is really exciting in its approach. It's basically a platform. I think of it as an R&D platform. They've got about 11 or 12 assets, and they'll ultimately probably have 25 assets and take it public in a, kind of like a Third Rock or Roivant, which would be the biotech comps there. And there's things that you're able to do when you can bring those teams in-house and kind of like share resources across them and learnings. But essentially, they're very open-minded to different pathways tackling cellular and tissue degeneration. So, mostly it's been small molecules so far in the assets that they've acquired, and they have mostly controlling stakes in those assets. They're largely preclinical. One of them is more mature, but I guess I would say watch the space with Cambrian. They're an incredible team. And we just did a round with, which I think was announced with Steve Jurvetson. So that's the one so far in the Rogue portfolio. And as I grow the team, I hope to bring on more people who, can focus purely on bio, which is not really my background.
That's a great place to wrap. For people who want to learn more about Rogue, where might you point them? Or any last minute plugs?
Oh, well, I definitely welcome more listeners to my podcast, Flux.
Yes, I'm a big fan of Flux. Flux is fantastic.
Rogue website coming soon, TBD on the list of things to get to. But yeah, shoot me a line, alice@roguevc.com. I'd love to hear from anyone building at the frontier. This is your time. And I'd love to be involved and help you build. And
just to give the audience context, Flux goes into the stories behind, frontier and deep tech founders and what they're building in a variety of different spaces. Is that how you describe it?
Yeah, Flux is a conversation with, what I think of as the next generation of Elon Musk's people who are working on really radical ideas, very technical ideas in different frontiers. And it shares their kind of personal stories and journeys. And we get into the companies and all sorts of weird questions about the future.
Awesome. Alex, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.